Story 1. Markers along the creek. This happened somewhere in a Kentucky Appalachian watershed basin, and that's as specific as I want to get. I was doing solo vegetation surveys that fall, the same kind of work I'd been doing for years. By then I had spent 3 consecutive autumns cataloging invasive tree disease patterns along remote Appalachian creek systems, which sounds more dramatic than it is. Most of it is walking, tagging, scraping bark, logging moisture, photographing lesions, then walking some more. You need long, uninterrupted stretches for it. If you're comparing spread patterns from one drainage to the next, you don't want a bunch of people tromping around your plots. So I usually worked alone, which suited me fine, at least that's what I told people. The honest version is uglier. It was easier to spend weeks cataloging dying trees than admit I'd become a stranger to my own daughter. After the divorce, every phone call with her felt like trying to step onto ice that had already started cracking. She was grown by then, living her own life, and I kept pretending the distance was temporary. Like once work slowed down, I'd know what to say. Work never really slowed down, and I never really learned what to say. Field assignments gave me an excuse. Bad signal, long days, dead battery, early start tomorrow. I could make all of it sound practical. I was good at the work, though. I don't mean that in a bragging way. I mean I knew how to move through mountain terrain without spooking myself over every snapped branch or shifted shadow. I knew what old hunter sign looked like, what runoff did to a trail, how fast fog could settle in a creek cut. I'm not somebody who hears one odd noise in the woods and starts building a ghost story around it. Most things have a reason, usually a boring one. That trip was mid-October, damp and cold enough that the air stayed in your clothes. The access road was an unmaintained forestry track that ended near an abandoned steel cable bridge over the creek. The bridge itself was still there, but not in any way you'd trust. Steel cables, warped planks, sections sagged enough that the creek showed through in long, dark strips. Rhododendron crowded both sides of the basin, so thick in places it felt like the road was being swallowed. The whole area had that sour, wet leaf smell trapped beneath dense creek fog. And by the time I'd hauled my cases out of the truck, my boot seams were already taking on that constant cold dampness that stays with you all day. I set up a temporary base camp near the bridge because it made the drainage easier to work in sections. Small tent, compact stove, equipment cases, 1 folding chair, 1 tarp line for wet gear. I was documenting fungal spread across marked tree clusters on both sides of the creek and the bridge, sketchy as it was. Still saved time if I used it carefully. When I started laying out my first route, I noticed a faded orange ribbon already tied around one survey tree not far uphill from camp. That caught my eye because the basin was supposed to be unsurveyed that season. Still, I didn't think much of it. Another crew could have passed through earlier and not updated the area notes yet. That kind of paperwork lag happens all the time. Somebody ties a marker, somebody forgets to log it, somebody else gets irritated 6 weeks later. Normal. The first day felt routine enough that I remember being almost embarrassed later by how comfortable I got. I spent most of it photographing bark samples and taking moisture readings from a run of young beech and hemlock along the drainage line. Fine grit kept sticking inside the spiral binding of my field notebook every time I set it on a stump or a rock. It made the pages grind when I flipped them. I remember that for some reason. I also remember overheating a can of stew because I got distracted checking lesion photos against old notes. The whole camp smelled like burnt tomato for an hour. Not smoke exactly, more that sour cooked-down smell canned food gets when it catches at the bottom. I ate it anyway. By dusk, the fog had dropped low enough over the creek that the bridge cables disappeared into it halfway across. I sat inside the tarp with my weatherproof binder in my lap, listening to creek water echo beneath the bridge while I updated notes. The sound bounced off the steel in a strange, flat way, Not loud, just repetitive. I had my damp survey gloves hanging near the stove to dry, and every time I moved them they made that rubbery, tacky sound against each other. My phone had one bar if I stood in exactly the right place by a stump near the road. I looked at my daughter's name in my contacts for a while, then put the phone face down on the case and kept writing. That's the part that sticks with me more than it probably should. I wasn't thinking about anything dramatic. Just that if I called, I'd have to explain why I hadn't called sooner, and I didn't have the energy for hearing myself do that again. The second morning was when I found the stone piles. There were 3 of them beside my equipment cases, fresh enough that the undersides were still dark with moisture. Each pile was neat, 5 or 6 creek stones stacked in short little columns, and they were arranged in evenly spaced lines pointing toward the water. Not random. Too straight for random. I stood there with my coffee packet in one hand and just looked at them for maybe 10 seconds, waiting for the immediate explanation to show up on its own. Then it did. Hunters, or hikers, or somebody local bored enough to make little trail markers while passing through. The basin wasn't exactly public park territory, but people cut through places like that all the time, especially if they know old roads or game runs. I knocked one pile over with my boot, not angrily, just to clear the space, and went on with the day. That was the pattern for a while. Nothing big enough to justify alarm, just small, organized things that felt wrong because they were organized. I started seeing orange ribbon markers ahead of me on routes I was actively selecting as I went. I don't mean they were scattered all over and I happened to notice them later. I mean I'd stop, look at the next rise or creek bend, decide to work that line first, then find a ribbon tied at eye level maybe a quarter mile into it. Sometimes faded, sometimes newer, all of them placed where I'd naturally look before stepping around a washout or ducking under laurel. I kept explaining it to myself in professional terms. Unlogged previous survey activity. Old wildlife markers, informal hunter navigation. The practical vocabulary was easy. That's one benefit of doing this kind of work too long. You can flatten almost anything with the right language. On the 3rd evening, I came back from creek measurements and found my folding chair turned away from the stove and facing the woods. I can't remember whether the chair was facing east or directly toward the creek the first time I noticed it moved. I know that's a useless detail, but it bothers me that I can't lock it down. What I do know is I hadn't left it that way. I was careful with camp layout because once my knees got stiff from a day in wet ground, I didn't like bending down to reorganize things in the dark. The chair had been squared to the stove when I left. I stood there staring at it, and from the outside I probably looked ridiculous, a grown man in a damp field jacket trying to decide whether a folding chair had malicious intent. I turned it back, checked my cases, checked the tarp line, checked the zipper pulls on the tent. Nothing missing, nothing broken. No obvious tracks because the ground right around camp was mostly leaf rot and roots. I kept telling myself I was assigning intention to ordinary mountain clutter because I'd been alone too long. That was true enough to be comforting. Isolation changes the scale of things. You notice patterns because there are so few interruptions. Human beings are good at building meaning out of repetition, even when repetition doesn't mean anything. Then I found the boot prints. It had rained just enough that the mud near a narrow creek turn held tread clearly. My own prints were there from earlier, deep heel, slight outward turn on the right foot, standard for me carrying a sample case. Beside them, almost touching in places, were smaller prints. Not child small, just smaller than mine. Whoever made them had stepped carefully into the soft ground next to my tracks, following the same line for about 8 or 10 paces. At one point they stopped and pivoted, the way somebody does when they're looking down and comparing two things. That's what got me. It didn't look like someone merely crossed my path. It looked like someone took an interest in the shape and size of my steps. I should have left after finding my boot prints copied beside those smaller tracks. I didn't. I told myself another field worker or some squatter was moving through the basin and had gotten curious. Curious people do strange things when they think no one's around. I had valuable survey progress already logged, weather holding for another day, and a route sequence that still made sense if I stayed. Pulling out over what was, at that point, still a collection of unsettling but explainable details felt like overreacting. That is the kind of phrase competence can hide inside. Overreacting. So I stayed. The next day felt almost normal on purpose. That's the best way I can say it. I made everything more procedural. Sample, photo, log, move, don't improvise, don't wander. If I saw a ribbon, note it and continue. If something was shifted at camp, check for missing items and continue. Professional alone is still alone, but procedure gives you a wall to lean against. That afternoon, I was working a contour above the creek when I noticed another ribbon tied to a sapling at shoulder height, fresh enough that the cut end hadn't started fraying. It marked a route I had only decided on after changing plans because one of my lower plots was too waterlogged to measure correctly. Nobody would have known I was taking that upper line unless they saw me turn onto it. That sat in my head the rest of the afternoon like a pebble in a boot. Small, but there every step. Back at camp, nothing was obviously touched. My stove was where it belonged, the sample bags were zipped. The binder was under the tarp, but the arrangement of my work had that same subtle wrongness the whole basin had started carrying. A pen set parallel to the binder edge instead of tossed across it. Gloves folded rather than draped. Equipment cases nudged into a straighter line than I'd left them. If it had been messy before and tidy now, that would have at least had shape to it, almost helpful. This was more like someone trying to imitate the idea of my camp without understanding the casual parts. By then it was getting under my skin, although even now I hate saying it that way because it sounds theatrical. What it actually felt like was my concentration shrinking. My shoulders stayed tight. I kept turning too quickly at harmless noises. The sour smell of wet leaves seemed stronger by evening, and every time the fog thickened under the bridge, I found myself watching the far side longer than necessary. I nearly packed then. I had the truck key out, that's true. I remember holding it and mentally running through what would need to go in first so I could break camp fast in the morning if I decided not to leave that second. But if I drove out after dark on that road tired and irritated, I could lose more than a night's work. A washed-out culvert or a bad turn in creek fog can wreck a truck easy. I told myself I'd finish one more evening route, sleep a few hours, and leave at first light if anything else happened. That was the decision that put me uphill after sunset. I'd seen a fresh ribbon marker on a narrow line climbing above camp, farther up than I planned to go that day. It was bright enough to stand out even in the failing light. My first thought was honestly relief. Another crew had to be in the basin. Maybe I was about to walk into a stupid explanation and feel embarrassed for the rest of the month. I took my headlamp but didn't switch it on yet because there was still enough gray light to see the trail breaks and rock edges. The ground got steeper fast, rhododendron thinning into a patchier slope with old blowdowns and exposed roots. My boots kept sliding on damp leaf litter. The air smelled colder uphill, less creek and more raw dirt. The ribbon led into a hidden clearing I hadn't seen from below because the slope folded around it. At first I thought I was looking at trash. Loose bark, scraped dirt, branches piled against a log. Then my eyes sorted it out and I stopped so hard my knees locked. Whoever had been there had arranged copies of my work patterns. Not the actual samples from my camp, at least not all of them, but versions of them. Bark pieces stacked in little ordered groups on a flat rock. Shallow circles scratched into the dirt in the same spacing I used for survey plots. Short lines scored beside them like notation marks. And laid across a rotting board was a hand-drawn map of the basin. Rough but accurate enough that I recognized the bridge, the road end, the creek split, and my camp marked with a square and an X through it. I didn't move closer right away. I just stood there, maybe 20 feet from it, feeling my pulse hit up into my jaw. The clearing was quiet in that mountain way where sound hasn't disappeared, it's just been pressed down. I could hear one drip hitting leaves somewhere behind me. I could hear the creek faint and far below. My own breathing sounded wet inside my collar. Then I saw the cigarette embers. 3 of them, maybe 4, low to the ground near a fallen log on the far side of the clearing. Not active flames, just recent orange points pulsing dull and bright as if they'd been set down or flicked into the leaves not long before I got there. Fresh enough that a thread of smoke still lifted off one. That's when all the practical explanations finally broke apart at once. Hunters don't build a duplicate of your work. Hikers don't map your camp. A bored squatter doesn't spend days arranging predictive markers unless they've been studying you. I should tell you I didn't do anything impressive. I didn't call out, I didn't rush downhill, I didn't even reach for the can of spray in my side pocket. I froze, fully. My body just stopped taking suggestions from the part of me that still believed movement was available. My hands had gone so tight around the strap of my case that when I finally looked later, there were little crescent marks from my nails in the webbing. Something shifted in the brush behind me. Not a dramatic crash, just a careful dry movement, one branch easing back into place and leaves brushing fabric. Close enough that I knew whoever made it had already been inside the space I'd have needed to turn through. I remember a smell then that didn't belong to the clearing. Stale cigarette smoke and that bitter chemical odor cheap detergent leaves in wet clothes. My mouth went metallic at the back. I finally moved because staying still felt worse than making noise. I dropped the case, actually dropped it, and stumbled forward and down slope instead of taking the sensible path back. Branches slapped my face and one root caught my right boot hard enough I went to a knee. For a second, I thought I heard footfalls pacing me in the brush off to my left, not running, just keeping level. I can't prove that part. I know how fear edits sound. But I know I did not feel alone on that slope. By the time I hit camp, I wasn't thinking in field terms anymore. I was grabbing what mattered and leaving what didn't. Binder, keys, wallet, sample drive, phone. The gloves stayed hanging. One case stayed unlatched. I remember fumbling with the tarp line and giving up on it because my fingers wouldn't pinch the knot right. The bridge cables were whining softly in the fog, and for one stupid second I thought about whether crossing the bridge would make me harder to follow. Then I realized I'd be trapping myself on the wrong side of the creek if somebody was already between me and the road. So I took the truck and bounced out of there half blind, tires sliding on wet rock, every shadow between the rhododendron trunks looking like a person standing still. I made it to a ranger station miles away sometime after midnight. The fluorescent lights in there were so bright they made my eyes ache. My jeans were soaked from one knee down and smelled like creek mud and stale sweat. The man at the desk gave me a paper cup of water that tasted like metal pipes and listened while I tried to explain the basin, the ribbons, the copied plots, the map. Saying it out loud made parts of it sound thinner than they had on the mountain, and I hated that. I could hear myself sounding like a man who'd been alone too long. Forestry officers went back out with search teams after daylight. They found evidence of an illegal hunting camp uphill from the basin and signs that someone had been monitoring the area for weeks. Makeshift bedding, food tins, cigarette butts, cut sight lines through brush. Enough to support the official conclusion, which was that I'd likely encountered territorial squatters operating illegal hunting camps in remote protected land. That was the response I got, nearly word for word. Territorial squatters, illegal camp activity. They took it seriously enough to document, not seriously enough to treat as anything stranger than men trying to scare off an outsider. Most of it did become explainable once more people were involved. The chair may be touched while someone checked camp. The copied boot prints, intimidation. The map, surveillance from a ridgeline. Even the arranged clearing could be read as a scare tactic by people who'd watched my routine long enough to mimic it. What got stuck was the ribbon placement. Searchers found several markers, but a few of them had been tied in locations the officers themselves said were difficult to reach without crossing dangerous cliff sections nobody on the team used. More than that, those markers kept appearing ahead of routes I had not yet selected myself until moments before hiking them. That's the part the squatter's explanation almost covers, but not fully. If somebody watched me from above, maybe they could anticipate my pattern. Maybe. I've said that to myself a lot. Experienced people move predictably. We choose efficient lines, we repeat habits. Still, there are a couple markers I can't fit into that logic without forcing it. I finished the season doing day work only. I told my supervisor the basin had become compromised by illegal camp traffic, which was true. I never went back overnight. I still do field work sometimes, but not the way I used to. I won't take solo assignments that require sleeping near unregistered trail systems, not anymore. And when I stop for the evening, even if it's only for 15 minutes to log samples, I always set my chair with the back against a tree or the truck door, so if it turns, I'll know exactly what direction it had to turn from. The mountains keep their own records. Sometimes I think I just crossed paths with organized men who understood routine better than I did. Sometimes I think about those markers waiting where I hadn't decided to go yet. I don't have a cleaner answer than that. I just know that now if I find bright ribbon in a place nobody logged, I turn around before I can talk myself out of it. Some stories leave you with the feeling that you were watched. The next one is worse than that. It's what happens when being alone stops meaning private. Story 2. The lights below the ridge. When I say I had dining chairs shoved under the front door handle, I don't mean in some dramatic movie way. I mean I was on my knees on a cold cabin floor in socks, dragging one chair at a time because I didn't want to make enough noise to tell whoever was outside exactly where I was standing. The wood kept catching on a braided rug and skipping. Every scrape sounded too loud. Outside, something was moving around the porch in slow circles. Not stomping, not sneaking either. Just a measured walk, boards creaking in the same sequence over and over, then stopping near the window, then starting again. It was after midnight. I know that much because the cheap wall heater in the living room had clicked off a minute before and the silence after it made the footfalls stand out. Dry static had been crackling from those heaters all evening, the kind of electric sound that makes old rooms feel even older. And once it stopped, I could hear everything else too clearly. My mouth felt so dry I kept swallowing and hearing it. I had my phone in one hand and couldn't get enough signal to make the call screen load all the way. I came to that cabin because I couldn't stay in my mother's apartment another night. She had died a few weeks earlier, and I'd spent days cleaning it out mostly by myself because there wasn't really anybody else to do it. Every drawer had receipts in it. Every closet had one winter coat too many. There were grocery lists in her handwriting on the side table, unopened mail under a lamp, 3 half-used bottles of vitamins lined up by the sink like she'd be back from the store in 20 minutes. I couldn't stop thinking about all the calls from my mother I let go to voicemail because I thought I'd answer later. Later turned out to be one of those words that only sounds harmless until it isn't. By the time I left the apartment for the mountains, I was sleeping in these little broken pieces, maybe an hour at a time, waking up with my jaw clenched so hard it hurt to chew. I'd found the rental online, 4 nights somewhere along a western North Carolina Appalachian ridge, and it looked quiet in the listing photos. Just a small place on a steep property off a gravel service road that branched from an old highway. Trees, porch, no close neighbors except a few scattered hunting cabins farther along the ridge. I told myself I needed silence, space, a place where none of my mother's things could surprise me from a corner. The owner didn't meet me. He left the keys inside a flower pot by the front steps and texted that hunters sometimes crossed nearby property lines, but that it usually wasn't a problem if I stayed near the cabin after dark. Even then, typing it out now, I know that should have landed differently. At the time, it just sounded like rural rental advice, one more local warning in a place where people say stuff like that casually. I got there late enough in the afternoon that the ridge was already losing light under the trees. The gravel drive was rutted and steep, and when I parked, I had that stupid city person thought of, great, if my car battery dies up here, I guess I live here now. I actually laughed at that alone, carrying 2 grocery bags and a plastic tote of old family photos like some woman in an antidepressant commercial. There were dried, muddy prints across the back porch when I went around to check the view. Broad sole, not fresh, partly flaked away. I convinced myself they were from maintenance workers or the owner. People have to clean rentals, people check pipes and heaters, people walk on porches. I unpacked anyway. The first evening was calm enough that I remember feeling a little ashamed of how badly I'd needed it. I made tea. I laid out the photos from my mother's apartment on the little kitchen table, sorting them into piles I thought I might keep, and piles I knew I should probably scan and get rid of. There was a sharp wood smoke smell lingering in the old blankets folded over the couch, like they had absorbed 10 winters of somebody else's fires. The couch blanket itself had rough fabric threads sticking out where a seam had frayed, and I kept winding one around my finger without noticing. I made instant oatmeal later because it was the easiest thing I had, and the powdery cinnamon smell sat in the kitchen longer than it should have. The wind moved through loose siding in soft, uneven breaths. Not eerie, just old house noise. From the kitchen window I could see small lights moving below the ridge now and then. Flashlights, I assumed. They never seemed connected to a parked vehicle or a visible campsite, which I noticed, but not in any useful way. Hunters, campers, people cutting through the lower property line. Everything had a reasonable version then. The second night I was in bed reading the same paragraph over and over because I couldn't focus. The bedroom wall behind the headboard backed up to the rear side of the cabin. Out of nowhere, 3 sharp knocks hit that wall. Hard enough to be wood on wood, not a settling sound. I sat straight up so fast the lamp tipped sideways on the table. I honestly don't remember whether the knocks came in groups of 3 or 4 because I barely slept that week. I just know they were distinct and close together. Knock, 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 maybe one more. I stayed still with the blanket half off and listened for branches, wind, anything that could turn it into a normal sound. The weather outside was completely still. No rain, no gusts, nothing moving hard enough to strike the siding. I still rationalized it as branches. There were trees close to the cabin. Old structures amplify weird impacts. Animals can sound bigger than they are. My brain was already running on grief and caffeine and too little sleep. I lay back down without believing myself, but I did lie back down. That was how the place changed, not all at once, one step at a time, almost polite. The next afternoon, I went for a short walk down the drive and back because I thought a little motion might help my head. When I returned, pantry items I'd left in a loose row on the counter were rearranged inside the cabinet. Oatmeal packets stacked neatly, tea bags in the wrong drawer. Crackers moved behind canned soup. I stood there with the cabinet open and tried to reconstruct whether I'd absent-mindedly put things away before I left. Grief does weird things to sequence. You do something and the memory of doing it never sticks. I kept trying to separate grief from reality because I knew how unstable I already felt being there alone. That night, a flashlight beam paused against the bedroom window for several seconds. It didn't sweep past like somebody walking. It just rested there, a pale rectangle through the curtain, steady enough that I could see the weave of the fabric. Then it vanished downhill. I got up, crossed the room, and stopped before touching the curtain because I didn't want my silhouette to show. My legs had that watery feeling they get right before you trip. I told myself there were hunters below the ridge and light travels strangely through trees. Maybe somebody had lifted a flashlight while talking and the beam happened to land there. Maybe. The third thing was the receipt. I had taken a grocery receipt out with some trash that morning. A long curling receipt from the bag with oatmeal, tea, canned soup, crackers, batteries. Nothing special on it. That evening I opened the front door and found it folded neatly on the porch railing. Not crumpled, not blown back. Folded into a rectangle like somebody had handled it carefully and left it where I'd see it. I should have left after finding that grocery receipt folded on the porch railing. Instead, I stood there with it in my hand, feeling my pulse thudding in my throat, and tried one more time to make the world act normal. Maybe the wind had moved the trash. Maybe I was confusing one receipt with another. Maybe the owner had come by to check something and picked it up. Every explanation was thinner than the one before it, and I knew it. I also knew I didn't want to drive back to town and sit in a motel room proving to myself I couldn't handle 4 nights alone without coming apart. From the outside, I must have looked like exactly what I was, a woman bargaining with a piece of paper because admitting fear felt too close to admitting I wasn't coping with anything else either. So I stayed one more night, then one more. The lights below the ridge kept showing up after dark. Sometimes one, sometimes two. They'd move in short starts and stops through the trees where there were no visible campsites. One night I watched them from the kitchen and realized I was holding my breath every time they disappeared behind trunks, waiting to see if they'd reappear farther uphill. They always did. On the 4th night I finally understood the pattern, and by then it didn't matter. I was in the living room with all the lamps off except the one by the couch because darkness outside felt safer if I could still see a small corner of the room. There were framed family photos on the shelf by the far window. Some of the ones I'd brought from my mother's apartment because I hadn't wanted to leave them packed in the tote. I looked up and saw the lights again below the ridge. At first I almost felt relief because they were where they'd been before, far down the slope. Then they started climbing, not wandering. Climbing directly uphill toward the cabin in silence. One would stop and the other would move, then both would disappear. Then both would show again closer than before. No talking, no vehicle sounds, no crunch of brush I could hear through the glass. Just 2 controlled lights ascending through black trees. I turned off the lamp and the room snapped into window reflection darkness. My own face was faint in the glass for a second, pale and floating over the slope, and then a beam passed lower across the yard, and I backed away so fast my hip hit the end table. Something fell, maybe a pen or a battery pack, I never found out. A minute later someone tested the back door handle once, not shaking it. Just one calm turn, like a person checking whether a room they'd booked was unlocked. Then the handle settled back with a small metal click. I was standing in the hallway by then, one hand against the wall because my knees felt loose, listening so hard I could hear the buzzing hum from the loose bathroom vent cover in the silence between outside sounds. Another flashlight came through the bathroom window in a narrow white slash. It crossed the sink, the toilet tank, the edge of the shower curtain, then left. I couldn't make myself run for the car because to reach it I'd have to cross the living room in front of 2 windows and then open the front door onto the porch where I'd already heard someone walking circles. My body knew that before my thoughts did. I just stayed pinned in the hallway, phone in hand, not calling because the signal kept dropping to nothing and because some scared part of me thought making noise would help them place me. Then I heard a voice outside, close enough to be under the eave. It said my first name. Not loud, quietly, almost conversationally, like someone trying not to wake another person in the house. Just my first name, repeated once, then again a few seconds later. At the same time, another beam moved slowly across the living room window, over the shelf, over the framed family photos, pausing on them long enough that the glass flashed. That's the moment I stopped trying to explain anything. My skin had gone slick with sweat, even though the heater had clicked off and the cabin was cold. I could feel my pulse in my gums. I dragged the dining chairs to the door. I shoved the little table against them, even though I knew it wouldn't do much. Every time the porch boards creaked around the cabin, I tried to track where the weight was, front, side, back, front again. Slow circles, testing, waiting to see what I'd do. The whole thing felt intimate in the worst possible way, like whoever was out there wasn't just trying a cabin, they were using my reactions. They knew where I slept. They knew which windows gave them angles into the rooms. They knew my name. I remember thinking stupidly that one of the photos on the shelf showed me as a kid with a missing front tooth, and I hated that strangers might be looking at that. I stayed like that until the first weak gray came through the curtains. The footfalls had stopped at some point, or maybe I stopped hearing them over my own blood pounding. I never slept. When dawn was bright enough to see the porch slats clearly, I shoved the chairs aside, grabbed my tote, my keys, my phone charger, not even all my groceries, and ran to the car. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the keys between the seat and the console the first time I tried to start it. I didn't report it from the cabin. I drove until I got to a gas station farther down the highway, one with 2 pumps and a coffee machine that smelled burned all the way to the restroom door. My fingers were cramped from gripping the wheel. County deputies met me there. They went up to the property later that morning. They found footprints and signs of trespassing around the cabin, enough that I didn't feel completely insane standing there telling it. But the explanation I got back was that local trespassers or poachers sometimes moved through isolated seasonal rentals in mountain areas and may have targeted an occupied cabin for theft opportunities. That was the tone of it, practical. Contained. Deputies attribute the incident to trespassers or poachers monitoring isolated seasonal rentals in mountain areas. No suspects identified. Lock your doors. Contact the owner. That kind of response. And maybe that's what it was. If I back away from the worst parts, a rational structure appears. People below the ridge noticed a lone renter. They tested property lines. They got bolder because I didn't leave. The pantry items, if that even happened the way I think it happened, could have been from an unlocked door while I was outside. The flashlight at the window was intimidation. The receipt on the railing was a message that somebody had been close enough to touch what I'd thrown away. Everything fits inside escalating trespass if you squint at it the right way. What doesn't fit is my name. I never met the property owner in person. We only used online booking messages. I never introduced myself to anyone on that ridge. I didn't chat with neighbors because I never saw any. The tote of family photos had my mother's last name on an envelope, not mine. And even if someone looked through that, my first name wasn't on the front of anything I remember. People say maybe social media, maybe mail in the car, maybe the owner mentioned it to somebody local. Maybe. I live inside that word now. I moved back to my apartment and brought the photos in one trip. I don't do mountain rentals by myself anymore. I don't even like ground floor hotel rooms. The lasting part isn't that I think someone's outside every night. It's smaller and somehow worse than that. No matter where I live, no matter how busy the street is, once it gets dark, I close every blind in every room before I turn on a single lamp. because I still can't stand the feeling of somebody learning me through the glass. There are places that make you feel lost. Then there are places that make you feel studied. The last story is from someone who went looking for answers and got closer to one than he wanted. Story 3. The trail camera sequence. I didn't think of this as one event when it started. That's probably the easiest way to explain why I stayed with it as long as I did. If you'd shown me the final shape of it on day 1, I would have backed out fast and let somebody else deal with it. But it came in pieces, and I was the kind of person who trusted pieces more than instincts. This happened somewhere in the southwestern Virginia Appalachian hardwood corridors, 5 miles beyond the nearest legal parking pull-off, in one of those stretches where game trails, old ATV cuts, and steep ravines intersect so often that the woods start feeling mapped even when they aren't. I spent a lot of weekends out there installing and checking wildlife trail cameras to monitor deer migration patterns before hunting season. Some of them were mine, some belonged to a small group of us who shared footage and compared movement corridors year to year. It was routine for me by then. I was comfortable alone, more comfortable than I ever was in town. Part of that came from an old failure I still haven't set down right. Years earlier, a friend of mine died in a climbing accident I should have stopped. That's the sentence version. The real version is longer and meaner, mostly toward me. There were warning signs. There was weather. There was a call I could have made harder. Afterward, I got obsessed with the idea that attention could save people if you applied enough of it. Stay alert enough, plan enough, notice enough, and maybe you keep bad outcomes from picking a person. That's not rational in a pure sense, I know that. But it settled into me anyway. I kept believing that if I stayed alert enough this time, maybe I wouldn't fail somebody again. The woods helped because terrain follows rules. Water cuts low. Deer prefer certain crossings. Sign accumulates where pressure accumulates. Even old fuel traces tell on people. There are parts of those corridors where the soil still holds a bitter gasoline smell from ATV residue years after the machine stopped being common up there, especially in warm, damp patches under leaves. Dry acorn shells crunch under heavy boots in a way that's different from hickory hulls. Disturbance leaves structure. I liked that. Maybe liked isn't the right word, but I trusted it. That late September, I headed in to retrieve several cameras before the season opened up fully and traffic changed the pattern data. I parked at the pull-off just after daylight. It wasn't much, just enough widened shoulder to get 2 trucks in if nobody parked like an idiot. The plan was straightforward. Hike in, swap cards, check battery levels, pull a few units entirely, then be back out before dark with time to sort footage at home. Before I even unloaded the pack, I noticed one of my tire tracks had a strip of mud scraped across it. It wasn't dramatic. Somebody had dragged a boot or a branch over part of the fresh tread where the shoulder softened near the ditch. I remember looking at it and thinking, that's all. People step near parked vehicles. Mud collapses. A raccoon could have done half that with enough determination. I threw the pack on, checked the thermos in the side pocket, and started in. The first couple miles were normal. Creek crossing, one fallen tulip poplar, a patch where the old ATV path still sank deeper than the surrounding ground because the base had been packed years ago. I reached the first camera, pulled the card, clipped in a fresh one, and moved on. Same at the second. Deer, raccoons, heavy rain bending brush. Nothing special. By late morning, I stopped beside a creek run and ate stale peanut butter crackers while sorting memory cards into labeled plastic bags. Crumbs got into my jacket pocket and stayed there, sticking to the lining. My dented thermos lid kept making a little metallic click every time I tightened and loosened it. I remember pine sap on the rubber grip of my flashlight too, even though I didn't need the flashlight in daylight. Those are the kinds of details that stay for no reason. The first wrong image came off a camera aimed across a narrow trail near a beach stand. There was a blurry figure standing behind a tree at around 2 in the morning, mostly hidden, barely visible except for one pale sleeve near the edge of the frame. Maybe pale. I can't swear the sleeve in that first image was white because the infrared footage distorted colors badly. In still form, it looked more like a human suggestion than a person, a vertical shape where no deer or bear should be. I leaned the viewer closer, replayed it, zoomed until the pixels broke apart, and decided another hunter had crossed through the zone overnight without realizing there was a camera there. Annoying, but common enough. If it had stayed there, this story wouldn't exist. At the next camera, I got a boot, not a full body, just the lower edge of somebody's leg and a boot near a ravine trail right at the left margin, like they had been standing just outside the trigger cone and only clipped it by mistake. At the third camera, there was a crouched shape behind brush, head turned toward the lens, not moving through, watching it. The fourth had a sequence that changed the whole direction of my thinking. A person stepped directly up to the camera, touched the housing with one hand, and then looked uphill past it toward the ridge where I usually camped when I stayed overnight in that corridor. That was the first time the images started talking to each other. A hunter crossing once is one thing. A person recurring across multiple cameras in partial fragments, always at the edges, is a pattern. A person touching a unit and looking uphill toward my normal camp zone is a different kind of pattern. I sat on a log with the card viewer in my hand and went back through older dates. The afternoon had gotten that flat late September brightness under the hardwoods where everything is visible but colorless. I remember hearing a squirrel scold somewhere above me while I replayed clips and felt the shape of the problem changing. Retroactively, a bunch of ordinary details became less ordinary. A few weeks earlier, I'd heard ATV engines in the distance one night, then stop abruptly all at once. At the time, I filed it under kids or illegal trail riders. Another time, I'd found cigarette butts beside a creek crossing and thought some teenagers had been fishing there. Once I'd noticed an odd stretch of flattened grass near one of my backup camera trees and assumed deer bedding. None of those things mattered until the images gave them a center. Then they all started leaning the same way. At first, I treated every strange detail like disconnected mountain nonsense because I didn't want to sound dramatic. I also didn't want to be wrong. There's a personality type in outdoor circles that turns every misplaced cooler into a conspiracy, and I've never had much patience for it. But what I was looking at wasn't random once I laid the cards out in order. Each camera revealed slightly more. A fragment, then another, then direct interaction. Whoever this was either didn't know all my placements and kept brushing the frame edge or knew them well enough to stand where they'd only partially register. Both possibilities were bad in different ways. The smartest move would have been to pull the remaining cameras and notify deputies right then. I didn't do that. I started investigating. Part of it was practical. If someone was moving deliberately through isolated hunting corridors, watching cameras and possibly watching camps, there was a decent chance they weren't just trespassing. There are guys who'll steal gear off a tree because it's easy money. There are other guys who study where people leave trucks where they sleep when they head out before dawn. The second kind worries me more. And if I had any old damage driving me at that point, it was this idea that paying better attention might let me get in front of something before somebody else took the hit. So I spent the next few evenings assembling a picture. I mapped timestamps. I overlaid camera positions on an old paper topo and then on a cleaner satellite printout at home. I marked where the partial figure first appeared, where the boot showed, where the crouched watcher faced, and where the person touched the camera and looked uphill. The movement wasn't random. There was a corridor to it, a loose arc that paralleled known game trails but favored spots with concealed sight lines across them. The old ATV path cut through the upper portion of that arc. So did two ravine lips with enough cover to watch anybody moving below. The more I looked, the worse the earlier footage got. There were clips I hadn't noticed the first time because I was focused on deer counts. A shoulder behind a trunk 3 frames before a buck entered. A hand at the bottom edge of a nighttime clip. A distant human form at the crest of a slope, small enough that I first took it for a broken branch. None of it was dramatic on its own. Together it told me somebody had been using my camera network as much as I had. Learning where it could see and where it couldn't. I didn't feel hunted then, not exactly, not yet. I felt challenged. That's the wrong word morally, but it's the honest one. Curious too. Problem solving gave me something steadier than fear to hold. If they were using a corridor, they could be predicted. If they could be predicted, maybe they could be caught on cleaner footage or confronted in a way that forced them out of the area. You can hear the flaw in that thinking because you're not the one inside it. From my side, it felt active, responsible, even necessary. I picked the abandoned ATV corridor for the weight because it intersected the most likely line of movement based on the timestamps. There was a bend where the track narrowed between saplings and a cut bank, with enough uphill brush to hide in and enough downhill view to catch lights or silhouettes if someone moved below. I got there before dark with 1 pack, 1 flashlight, 1 thermos, no intention of firing a weapon unless there was no alternative. I wasn't there to ambush anybody. I was there to identify what I was dealing with and call it in with something better than vague concern. Waiting alone near that ATV corridor was reckless, and I knew it before sunset. I nearly turned around twice. Once while I was settling into position, and once when the woods shifted into full dark and every settled smell became more noticeable. Damp dirt, old gas in the soil, leaf mold, something faintly synthetic that could have been fabric or plastic warming and cooling. But I'd already invested too much thought by then, which is another way people talk themselves into bad decisions. I stayed crouched against the bank with my hood up, trying not to move enough to shine skin in the dark. Nothing happened for a long time. Then, sometime after the kind of dark where tree trunks become only slightly darker than the air around them, I saw the first covered light. Not an open flashlight beam. A hand-covered glow pulsing through fingers, then disappearing, then showing again farther down the corridor. A second light answered from uphill. 2 figures moved between the trees with practiced pauses, stopping at intervals to look downhill toward the lower trails. They weren't out joyriding. They weren't wandering. They were checking lines. I stayed still and watched them close distance. My thighs had started trembling from the squat, not fear at first, just strain. Then one of them altered course. I didn't understand it immediately because the movement was small, a slight turn uphill, then another. I'm saying he because of size and gait, though I can't prove it, started angling toward the bank where I was hidden, not with a flashlight on me, not searching visibly, just adjusting in a way that lined him up with my position. That's when the whole assembled picture flipped around. I wasn't waiting where they might pass. They already knew where I would think to wait. My mouth went dry so fast my tongue felt thick. For a second, my legs didn't work. That's not figurative. I had the clear thought that I should back up through the brush and create distance, and my body stayed fixed to the ground like the message had to cross a river first. The nearer figure came within maybe 15 feet, then 10, head angled as if listening. I moved when he was close enough that not moving felt like surrender. I lunged downhill off the bank and hit him around the chest and shoulder. It wasn't clean. We both went sideways into brush. Something cracked under us, maybe dead limb wood. He smelled like damp wool and stale smoke. My hand caught heavy jacket material and slid because the fabric was slick with cold moisture. He grunted once, low, not surprised exactly, more annoyed. I got one arm around him and for half a second thought I might actually hold him there. Then rocks started coming from uphill. The second person was throwing them hard into the brush around us, not wild enough to be panic, deliberate enough to break my grip and make me shield my head. One hit the bank just above my ear and burst dirt into my face. Another struck my shoulder. The first figure twisted loose. I held onto part of the jacket and felt the seam rip under my hand. By the time I got to my feet, they were both moving, one crashing through saplings downhill, the other angling across the corridor and vanishing into dense brush where following would have meant running blind into ground. They probably knew better than I did. I took 2 steps after them and stopped. Not because I made a wise decision in the moment. Because my chest locked up and I realized I could no longer hear only them. I could hear the entire forest again, and that made it worse. Every small movement in every direction seemed possible. I was suddenly very aware of being one person in a dark corridor with unknown paths above and below me. My hands were shaking so badly the torn jacket piece kept fluttering against my wrist like a live thing. I got out of there without trying to be a hero twice. At the truck, I found myself checking behind it before I unlocked the door, which hadn't been a habit before then. The dome light came on and made the inside of the cab look exposed and stupid. I drove to cell range, called the sheriff's office, then went back only as far as I had to in daylight with deputies. They did recover things: hidden campsites, stolen hunting gear, damaged trail cameras from nearby corridors, not just mine. Enough evidence that the whole situation moved from my private suspicion into an actual investigation. I handed over footage, timestamps, map notes, and the torn jacket fabric. The deputy's conclusion was that organized theft crews likely used hunting corridors to monitor isolated outdoorsmen and steal unattended gear. That's the official line I got, and to be fair, it accounts for a lot. If you know where people park, where they leave stands, when they head out, you can make a living off stolen gear in places like that. I've heard of worse. What frustrated me was the reduction of it. Theft crews, equipment thieves. As if all that watching was only about optics and resale value. Maybe it was. Maybe that's enough. But some of the footage, some of the positioning didn't feel opportunistic. It felt anticipatory. Like they weren't just noticing chances, they were working routines. No arrests came out of it. The investigation is technically still open as far as I know. Every now and then somebody will mention another busted camp or a spate of missing equipment in a neighboring corridor, and I'll think about calling to compare notes, then decide not to become that guy. The piece I can't settle is one image from 3 nights before the final confrontation. I found it only after the deputies had taken copies of the main files. It was on a camera positioned closer to the legal pull-off than the others. One I hadn't checked carefully because it mostly caught road approach and wasn't useful for deer. Time-stamped 3 nights before I went back in for the retrieval. In the frame, behind my parked truck, stood a person. No face, just a figure in the dark at the edge of the infrared wash, silent, looking toward the driver's side. The problem with that image is timing. I had not publicly mentioned returning that weekend. I hadn't posted about it. I hadn't told more than one buddy I might go in, and even that conversation was loose, nothing date-specific. So the rational explanation is coordinated criminal surveillance targeting hunters. People watch pull-offs, learn vehicles, note patterns, and make educated guesses about return trips. That explanation nearly covers it. But that image was taken before I came back in. And it shows somebody behind my truck as if they were already waiting on a date I hadn't fixed out loud yet. Maybe they just watched often enough to know I'd be back sooner or later. Maybe they had seen my routines over months and knew the preseason retrieval window. Maybe they got lucky. I still run trail cameras. I wish I could say I quit and learned a clean lesson, but that's not true. What changed is the structure around it. I rotate routes unpredictably now. I don't mention timing to anyone unless they need it. I don't stay overnight in the same camp area twice in a row. And I never park in the same location twice, even when the pull-off is the obvious choice and even when it means adding another mile to the walk-in. If I'm being completely honest, part of me is still assembling evidence from that whole thing. New reports, old clips, scraps of memory that slide into place months later. That's the ugly thing about pieces. They keep offering to become a picture. I don't know whether what I brushed against out there was a theft crew with patience or something more focused than that. I know only that the last clean, ordinary detail I remember before any of it turned real was the sound of dry acorn shells breaking under my boots on the way in. And now, whenever I hear that same crunch behind me on a trail, I stop walking and wait until I know whose route just crossed mine.